Scandinavia is one of the most interesting regions in Europe. From the Vikings ravaging England to the Swedish Empire almost preventing the rise of Russia, pagan to Protestant, its history is long and storied. However, one of the most interesting questions people generally have is that of a potential Scandinavian Union, like Britain, or more often, Germany and Italy arising during the 19th century. However, what if I told you that Scandinavia was united under one monarch for just over a century? The Kalmar Union was negotiated by Margaret I of Denmark, making her queen of all of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. But dynastic complications and the separate geopolitical interests of the three countries would tear it apart in the 1520s. But that of course begs the question, what if the Kalmar Union survived and Scandinavia united? Now, like I said, the Kalmar Union was the result of Queen Margaret of Denmark marrying the King of Sweden and Norway and having a son. However, that son, Olaf III, died at age 16, which resulted in new royal elections and Margaret's nephew, Eric, having to reconquer Sweden, and he wasn't exactly popular in Sweden as a result of this. But that's also our point of divergence. If we can keep Olaf from dying, then the union will already be much more legitimate in the eyes of the varying aristocracies and harder to break. Olaf died really unexpectedly, possibly, and even likely, by poison, and that's not hard to prevent either. Now, the Scandinavian kingdoms all used elective monarchies and were each able to elect different kings, but if Olaf is able to even be a decent king and maintain the personal ties between the nobility, which is admittedly quite the challenge, it's reasonably plausible the elective monarchy of the three kingdoms could become a rubber stamp. Multiple countries ostensibly used elective monarchies, like the HRE, which was just coming into a stable succession under the Habsburgs at the time, Hungary, and Bohemia. Poland-Lithuania is another example, but they fell apart, so we're going to ignore them. Now, Olaf dying at 16 leaves us with very little precedent for what his reign would be like. His mother was the more domineering monarch comparatively and effectively ruled all three states until her death in 1412, but that's 20 years after Olaf himself died, making it a flawed example. For all we know, Olaf could wind up being some absolutist nutcase who wants to conquer Russia before Russia even matters, or exists. Of course, in reality, he's likely just an alright king who focuses on cementing his ties to the nobility of what is now an absolutely massive realm. In terms of marriage, the best situation for him is likely a Swedish noblewoman to legitimize his kingship in that country. The Norwegians, while still hesitant about unification, were not nearly as strong as Sweden was, meaning they're not the people that Olaf needs to impress. Sorry, Norway. Now, a big problem for the Kalmar Union was that it was centered so heavily on Denmark, to the point where you could reasonably call it the Danish crown owning Sweden and Norway. It was the most populated and richest of the three kingdoms, and its trade war and actual wars with the Hanseatic League were a big part of why they even pursued the union in the first place. But this also led to resentment among the Swedish nobility, since they were taxed in order to pay for these wars that were of little benefit to them even when they did win. This ties back to Olaf needing to convince them to buy into the union. Thus, I'll say that Olaf or his son really takes a liking to Stockholm and decides to mostly rule from there. The monarchy will still be very keen on the battle with the Hanseatic League and Danish finances, but it won't be seen as harshly by the Swedish nobility in a world where they have more direct access to that monarch. Now, one of the first problems for the Kalmar Union was the rule of Eric of Pomerania. Autocratic and too focused on Denmark, his expensive wars would get all three kingdoms to hate him. Taxes for Denmark and Norway, and the Hanseatic blockade stopped Sweden from exporting iron, making their economic woes even worse. However, as he was the nephew of Margaret I, both Olaf and his hypothetical son would have a claim to the province of Pomerania, which could prove useful in establishing power on the continent. And Scandinavia will need to do that if it wants to compete with the rising Polish. While the Union was not yet a permanent commonwealth, even in the 1380s to 1420s, Poland and Lithuania were incredibly closely integrated and were ruled by the same king, Vladislav II, whose son would also become king of Hungary and Croatia for good measure. Now, we probably don't have time to mess with any of that, so for now we'll just say that Scandinavia fights like one war with the Hansa, and from there focuses on the Poles as best it can, which in this case means pursuing a marriage policy closely tied to the Holy Roman Empire. This likely means a surrender on the Hansa question, at least for now. The matter of Holstein will remain in conflict, but the House of Fulkung can deal with that when the three most relevant kingdoms in Eastern Europe aren't all under one man. Thankfully, we aren't going to mess with Varna, meaning that Hungary will drift away from Poland very quickly. In addition, in order to keep Sweden satisfied, the Union will need to attempt expansion into Estonia or Livonia, the northern Baltic coast. It's a lucrative trading region that would also help them maintain security in the Baltic. And like I said, they do have a claim on Pomerania since the Duke is Margaret's nephew, but that seems like it would be a bit much for this time period. I don't want to turn this into a game of Europa Universalis after all. Keeping all of this together in the 1400s will already be difficult enough, and the Union of Kalmar isn't likely to unite under one kingdom immediately, since the aristocracy in each kingdom would still find that repulsive. Which brings us to another problem. During the 15th to 16th centuries, a lot of countries were more or less dynastic cobblings that were united only in terms of foreign policy and usually what kind of money they had. Spain, two separate countries, each made up of three really tiny monarchies, though the king's power was a bit more uniform in each of them. Poland-Lithuania, two different countries, one king, two different legislations, and somehow that works better than having them actually united. Russia, they didn't really exist yet, the Habsburgs don't even have all of Hungary yet, and it's still administered very separately than their German possessions, which at this point are their more powerful domains. Oh, and this is all before they inherit Spain. Scandinavia is no different than these other countries. While Margaret was able to foster an era of absolute rule in all three states, and this would likely continue through her son and grandson without them being deposed, that's really hard to keep up when all three of them are separate monarchies with elective kings. In fact, even Margaret wasn't entirely unchallenged. The original Treaty of Kalmar included an act of union that never passed, and because it didn't pass, the monarchy will be fighting a much steeper battle than other powers to centralize the state around itself. Amassing and maintaining that political power takes time, skill, and a lot of money. While bureaucracy can certainly help in this regard, France and England both had more effective state control than Spain or Poland, allowing them to break past feudalism sooner, although not completely in the case of France. Building that bureaucracy is difficult, and you know what makes it harder? Having to do it 3 times, while also having to bribe the nobility to keep electing your kids as king, especially when you're in the middle of a trade war with the neighbors who control the best way to the open ocean. While Gustav Vasa managed to do it in Sweden in the 1520s, he had the advantage of Lubeckian financial aid, and the fact that the Swedish nobility elected him specifically to break free from Denmark, so there were more incentives to go along with it. Add in Protestantism giving him control over the church, and he's got an easy hand compared to any united Scandinavian king in this world. So, considering the status of their monarchy and lacking centralization, Scandinavia won't exactly be rolling in dough for a while. Denmark is wealthy and it will likely keep the union afloat, but it would be remiss to compare them to the Dutch or even the English at this point. In addition, they are pretty sparsely populated. Cobbling together some numbers from the universities of Aarhus and Lund respectively, and the World Population Review, all three of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway would have about 1.7 million people in 1500. In contrast, the Kingdom of England is around 2.6 million according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, these are estimations, and there's the possibility that places like Iceland and Finland aren't being counted properly, but frankly, none of these countries have censuses going back that far for me to get the actual numbers. Thankfully for Scandinavia, it is still possible to expand and grow despite these institutional problems. While I doubt they would be able to fully subjugate the Baltic shore during the 1400s, Estonia is definitely possible, as is Eastern Latvia, which will include the very lucrative city of Riga. It's likely the second or third largest city in the entire country, and an absolute goldmine of a Baltic port, bolstering the economy. Plus, the big thing is still convincing the Swedish nobility that the Union of Kalmar is actually worth their time. In addition, Russia is still a patchwork of Mongol tributaries and city-states, and while Muscovy is rising, it's still dealing with the Golden Horde and subjugating the rest of Russia. So, by this timeline's mid-1400s, we moved the de facto capital of the Kalmar Union to Stockholm and had the monarchy actually take their interests seriously. At the same time, they've still tried to take over Schleswig-Holstein in order to maintain the loyalty of Denmark. That's all well and good, but what about Norway? Well, they were easily the weakest crown in the Union. The Kingdom of Denmark-Norway was in fact just Denmark controlling Norway, and they were cemented in an active union until after the Napoleonic Wars. So, keeping them under control isn't really the hard part compared to Sweden or Denmark. Going forward, the Reformation makes things messy. See, all three kingdoms eventually converted to Protestantism in the 1500s and would be instrumental in the 30 Years' War. But at the same time, the messy nature of succession in Scandinavia makes this riskier. I think that in all likelihood they do eventually become Protestant, since as a general rule, the further a region was from the Pope, the more likely it was they converted, especially in Germanic Europe, but it's hardly an absolute thing. I'd almost expect a civil war over the question, perhaps there's some disputed election or something. In addition, the conquests in the Baltic make this even more complicated than it would otherwise be, and likely result in a war with Poland or Muscovy, assuming they've still conquered Russia. Regardless, we'll still assume that Scandinavia wins that war, since as always, they are the protagonists of this video. Now, before we jump ahead to the 30 Years' War and colonization, let's play around with the demographics. The World Population Review gives the three countries of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway about 1.9 million people. We're going to multiply this number by 1.2 or so to account for the conquest in the Baltic and the lack of wars between the three kingdoms that would harm the population. I'm kind of pulling that ratio out of my ass, but a relatively low population is a big problem for Scandinavia if it wants to be a great power going forward. I do also want to say that I'm not sure if Iceland or Finland are accounted for with those numbers, since they were respectively part of Sweden and Norway, but obviously are not now. I'm electing to assume that they are counted because it seems better to not count them myself, rather than to count them twice. Either way, that brings Scandinavia to 2.28 million, still on the lower side of the great powers. It's about half of England's population, but I'm not a miracle worker. So, no more making Brazil 80% of the US's population for this channel. Sorry for the very quick interruption, but if you're enjoying the video so far, please consider subscribing so you can stay up to date with future releases. With that out of the way, let's get right back to the show. Now, very interestingly, I think that the regional dialects would start to erode after this length of unification, especially after a conversion to Protestant that sees the king become head of church, since now the Bible can be written in the local dialect. But that local dialect is already very similar across all three countries. In fact, both Swedish and Norwegian are mutually intelligible, while the Danes are apparently more difficult but not incomprehensible. So it seems viable for the three to reconverge into a modern Norse language. I'm not sure how it would compare to the three in real life, let alone Icelandic, which is closer to the Old Norse of the Viking settlers, but that's something to keep in the back of the mind. Now, as we get into the 30 Years' War, this is when Scandinavia is going to burst onto the scene quite nicely. Both Sweden and Denmark were part of the Protestant alliance in real life, which I think is reasonable enough precedent to assume they would get involved even with the divergent politics from our timeline. Now, frankly, the Swedes hard carried under Gustavus Adolphus and his own tactics, but you'll notice he is decidedly not in charge here, so they might not be as badass as you would think. But this is still likely to be a major win for the northern giant. With the united Denmark and Sweden, they'll likely have the biggest army in the far north of Germany. Austria will be fighting France, and the Poles are unlikely to get involved, which will allow them to have their way in the region. I would fully expect the total cession of Schleswig-Holstein to Denmark and the conquest of Pomerania, the latter of which was de facto accomplished by Sweden for a while anyway, and it would likely be a goal of united Scandinavia in order to secure Baltic hegemony against the German upstarts and as a base of operation against the Poles. Diplomatically, Scandinavia will be very pro-French. Their primary rivals will be countries like England, the Netherlands, and the German states, and guess who also hates or wants to control all three of those regions? In fact, Scandinavia will fit very nicely into the Franco-Ottoman alliance, since their other challengers are Russia and the Commonwealth, who both also hate the Ottomans. And Austria is here as well, but again, they're a German state, so they're already mentioned. Now, none of these alliances would be constant or permanent. It's entirely plausible for one Scandinavian king to help Russia beat up Poland so they can take over Prussia, and then turn around and work with the Ottomans to beat up Russia, or even gang up on France with the Dutch and English due to France sticking them over in a treaty with Austria or something. But these would be general trends, like most alliances were in our timeline. But in general, I will put Scandinavia as on the side of France in conflicts like the War of Austrian or Spanish Succession if they still happen here, especially as North America becomes more important, since now England will be moving against their cash cows. Also, for the sake of things, the 1650s is when I'm putting an active union between the three kingdoms. It's entirely arbitrary, but it's also about 300 years after the Union of Kalmar was ratified anyway, and they haven't had a period of separation in this timeline. The Spanish and British personal unions both had about 200 to 300 years before they actually federated into one monarchy each, so this gap works well enough for my purposes. Thus, in 1660, the kingdoms of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway become the tripartite Kingdom of Scandinavia, with a capital in Stockholm. There's probably some kind of parliament or riksdag, since Sweden and Norway both did have informal bodies for that purpose in our timeline, and while Denmark was more absolutist, that was again in our timeline under a completely different line of succession. Also, for the sake of my brain, we'll assume the active union ends elective succession in favor of primogeniture. Entirely moot at this point, but if they were ever going to formalize the status quo, now would be the time. It's worth noting that this early council would be more like the French Estates General than the English Parliament. Firstly, while its codification is likely a condition for the active union in the first place, it will lack a lot of the teeth that the English Parliament already had in the 1600s. Limits on royal taxation were a constant in English law going all the way back to the 1200s with Magna Carta, and royal subversion of this principle led to the English Civil Wars. Thank you, Charles. Hell, even France had something similar, it's just that Louis XIV was enough of a strongman and had enough power over the colonies that it was a moot point. In contrast, Scandinavia does not have such limitations on royal power, especially without the Vasas in Sweden. In addition, the Swedish Riksdag, the only real precedent we have for what this would look like, followed the French model of representing estates rather than provinces and people. Philosophically, this is closer to corporatism than liberalism and has historically proven untenable, which is why all three eventually switched to the model seen in the House of Commons. I don't know, maybe the Riksdag maintains this class model as an upper house while a more populist parliament emerges later. That could be neat. Regardless, despite the existence of a royal council, there are very few, if any, checks on royal power. Now, a common question regarding the Scandinavian countries is why they weren't active colonial powers when regions like the Netherlands and Portugal were. Even Scotland tried, and while the answer is a bit more in depth than this, we again cannot overstate the population problem. Sweden, which by now is the most populated part of the Union, has a smaller population than the Netherlands. And even the buffed out Scandinavia is around half as populated as England. However, there's a caveat here. The Scandinavians were late to the potato growing party and didn't start until nearly a century after it was introduced to the region. Considering Frederick the Great of Prussia essentially had to trick his peasants into thinking it was valuable so they'd steal it and grow it that way, I am not surprised. But at the same time, if we have a successful colony in the Americas earlier, that means potatoes are introduced sooner, so really we can go about this a few ways. So logistically, the earliest place for Scandinavia to colonize is going to be the northeast of North America. Newfoundland to Massachusetts. Of course, they'll likely have to fight the English and Dutch for it, but the English were only that far north because the Puritans were bad navigators, and the Dutch were only interested in the fur trade, which, while lucrative, paled in comparison to nearly every other one of their ventures. So I think it's fair to say that we can squeeze the Scandinavians into the area. Now, I have no idea what they'd call it, since frankly we don't know, nor do I particularly care, if it's being colonized more by Danes, Swedes, or Norwegians. One thing I'm sure of, though, is that once this colony is off the ground, it's probably more actively looked after than other settler colonies. The main reason the English colonies developed such an independent streak is how far they were from the effective British occupation. The ones that were on the Canadian Shield or Newfoundland were much more heavily tied to Britain. The French barely settled their claims, and New Netherlands lasted like a decade, I think. Here, Scandinavian America is very much within Norse striking distance. Iceland and their singular fort in Greenland would make it much easier to supply permanent naval presence in the area, since Scandinavia doesn't have to go across the broadside of the ocean. Now, the far more lucrative colonies were always the Caribbean and West Africa, for obvious reasons. Sweden's efforts at both of these were easily stymied in real life, while Denmark maintained possessions in both arenas until the 1900s. As a result, Scandinavia will absolutely be able to maintain a larger colonial empire than in real life, which will bolster textile industries and all that typical stuff, factoring in the East India Company that they would have, and I would argue that Scandinavia would be able to compete with the Netherlands in terms of economics. Going by the same World Population Review numbers and multiplying again by 1.2, Scandinavia in 1700 would have about 3.36 million, while the Dutch would have about 2 million. Now, frankly, the margin of error for that is getting higher and higher because now we're ignoring Pomerania, Prussia, and the areas I wasn't sure would count, so my own estimation is about 4 million. While still outmanned by the other great powers around them, England, France, Poland, and Russia, this easily puts them in the heavyweight category. As a result, I would expect the 1700s to be just as dominated by wars between Scandinavia, Poland, and Russia as in real life. How this ties into the broader European balance of power doctrine that was emerging in the West is challenging, because letting Scandinavia or Poland get too strong threatens Austria, which bolsters France, which means that England has to get involved, but if they crush the North, then suddenly Amsterdam is able to work with France to oust Britain from the North Sea. Point being, the 1700s will be a fight for long-term supremacy between all of these powers. And ultimately, I'm not sure how that fight would go, because Scandinavia has all that delicious overseas blood money and is likely militarily ahead of Russia, and unlike Poland, the state isn't rotting under its own weight, but Russia absolutely outmans it. Like I said, the best estimate I can give for Scandinavia's actual population in 1700 is about 4 million. Russia, according to the same source, had 10. Containing that beast will be incredibly difficult unless Scandinavia is in a near-permanent alliance with whatever remains of the Commonwealth or the Turks. Not to mention, Scandinavia does not have nearly as much coal as the other European powers stumbled into, meaning that industrialization will be a lot more difficult for them. Granted, it's not like Russia did great at that either, and there's the chance that Scandinavia's colonial empire is able to make up the difference, East Africa or India for example, which could be beneficial. Unfortunately, I think I need to wrap up this scenario here. With the Kalmar Union surviving, Scandinavia is able to contest Eastern Europe against Poland and Russia for well over a century, eventually taking over the bulk of the Baltic Sea and becoming a European great power. Converting to Protestantism and a conflict over Pomerania pitted them against Austria, bounding them to the broader French coalition whenever those sides came to blows. Their colonial empire, while small, is wealthy, and they have proven themselves to be a true heavyweight in European politics. Before we go, please consider checking out my merch store so I can keep pumping out content, and a thank you to channel members Imagination, Nafumato, Grimwalt, and Dubs Main, with an extra thank you to Grimwalt and Dubs Main for joining at the exclamation point level. Thank you so much for watching, and join me next time as we explore another alternate world.